Bienvenidos al nuevo presidente. Libertarian candidate Javier Milei has become the new president of Argentina, defeating his rival and current economy minister, Sergio Massa. Now, Milei rode a wave of popular discontent over Argentina's horrific economy to victory in the recent elections. The country suffers from 143% inflation. 4 in 10 Argentinians live below the poverty line.
Milei's critics are concerned about his proposed wide-sweeping reforms, including swapping the peso for the U.S. dollar, eliminating the central bank, alongside a number of other government ministries.
Here to talk to us about this historic victory and what his presidency might look like is Associate Editor at Reason, Liz Wolfe. Liz, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, nice to have you back. And I know you've looked at this issue more than we have and have interviewed experts for Reason about the situation there. Talk to us a little bit about Javier Milei's appeal. Obviously, he's been described as a libertarian, which, one of our people, although like elsewhere in the media, they're like, no, he's a far-right Trumpist. So can you go over his views a little bit?
Absolutely. So Milei's kind of an interesting character. He definitely aesthetically and rhetorically seems an awful lot like Trump. So I can understand where some of that characterization is coming from. He is very blunt. He is very candid. He does engage in some culture war sparring. Let's be real. He has like a past life as a tantric sex coach. I mean, he's a bizarre, iconoclastic character. However, the great however is he is legitimately seeming like a classical liberal in a bunch of different ways. I mean, he is interested in, slashing the central bank. He's interested in dollarization. He's really, really interested in cutting public spending in Argentina. So he's basically looking at the inflationary situation there and saying, we have to make drastic changes. We're in an emergency situation. This is something that so few administrations and so few candidates recently have really advocated, and people are struggling and suffering on the ground because of hyperinflation. So it's wonderful that he believes in that. He is a free trade guy. He's into drug legalization. In a lot of ways, he is legitimately a pretty hardcore libertarian. He is also not stooping into sort of Bolsonaro type discourse or Duterte things about trying to use authoritarian means to crush political opponents or drug dealers or people he dislikes. That's something you sometimes see from these like wannabe autocrats, and he's really not that so far.
I have seen some people having mixed feelings about this, not as you kind of described, having difficulty casting him as libertarian versus MAGA, and the mix of policies that he's supporting puts him somewhere in between. I've seen some mixed feelings about how he immediately showed support for Israel as we continue to watch the siege on Gaza. He said he has no problem with the IMF because his own policies, fiscal policies that he plans to implement, are more extreme than what the IMF, more austere than what the IMF would impose on Argentina. How do you parse the mix of policies that he's been advocating for here, and how are they being perceived? How is the election being perceived in Argentina?
Well, I chalk it up to the fact that libertarians are frankly hard to place, as you know, because you co-host with the Libertarian and have people like me on as guests, right? Like, we do have a little bit of a bizarre hodgepodge of beliefs that I think is sometimes a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of people who are more devoutly on the left or right. And I use devoutly deliberately. So I think Milei is very much aligned with that, in keeping with that. But the thing that I would also say is I'm a little bit worried about some of the rhetoric that we've seen from him. We specifically saw a little bit of almost foregrounding possible election denialist claims, casting doubt on election integrity. That is before he actually won it. So stuff like that makes me a little bit concerned, stealing things from the Trump playbook. However, I would also say there is a consistent and pretty massive growing cohort of younger Argentines who basically looked at the legacy of Peronist politicians, since the 1950s and say, hey, this has driven our economy absolutely into the ground. We fear for our futures. We don't really have the ability to save. We can't buy homes for ourselves. Our money is essentially worthless. And I think there's a lot of younger people in Argentina who maybe aren't even particularly excited about the culture war stuff, but are a little bit like, well, I'm 30 years old and I have no means of saving for my future and building a family and building a life. So I think that's a part that a lot of the media misses.
Initially, in the early round of voting, he didn't do as well as expected, and then they had this very decisive victory in the ultimate election, which took place the other day. What do you think he's going to concentrate on first, and what does improving the financial situation actually look like?
Well, we have to be realistic here. He doesn't have a coalition. He doesn't have a ton of allies in the government. He is a political outsider. The media has been right in that way. I think there have been a lot of mainstream media headlines that have described him as, a MAGA type, a far-right populist. And it's like, well, he's an individualist. He's not a populist, really. That's not how I would characterize him. And there's a lot that talks about what a threat he is. Really, he's going to be pretty reined in by the fact that he just doesn't have that much of a coalition to govern with yet. And so to some degree, what we will probably see is a system of pretty extraordinary gridlock, at least for a while. It'll be kind of interesting to see whether he actually has the pragmatism and has the ability to build a coalition to actually push some of these things through. I think that could possibly be a really frustrating thing because he might have good ideas for especially cutting public spending, cutting the amount of that is spent on social services. That could be something that is legitimately helpful in terms of righting Argentina's ship. But I do think it's important to take all of this with a hefty grain of salt. We don't know how this is going to play out in the real world. And platitudes and talk are one thing, and they're very cheap, but we actually have to see some results from him.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if he's successful. Some of the agenda points that he has that have gotten some scrutiny include a desire to legalize the sale of children and human organs, abolishing public health care and education and transportation, as you've mentioned, and abandoning monetary sovereignty. That is, a significant move. And I think that's one that most Americans can't really wrap our head around, the idea that we would abandon the dollar entirely for another country's currency. I do think it'll be interesting to play out if he is able to implement some of these things, what a kind of maximalist libertarian vision looks like, and whether or not people are going to have a different perspective on the value of some of those social safety net programs if, in fact, they no longer can rely on them and the economic upswing to the economy either doesn't happen or doesn't accrue to people at the very bottom, which often happens. So I'm for one, apprehensive but interested to see what it looks like to see real libertarianism play out on a national level.
Yeah, now if it doesn't work, we can point to Argentina.
For selling children?
Yeah.
I think
what do you mean?
organs.
Organs, yeah.
Yeah,
Not
just
like
organs.
human beings.
I heard you say selling children and organs, or maybe that was just a weird sleight of mouth.
Just selling organs.
No. Oh, just organs. Yeah, no, legalizing organ selling is one of those things. There are a few sort of like oddball libertarian proposals that I think rub people the wrong way, but legitimately we have 43,000 people who have like end stage kidney failure every year in the United States, and we have a massive shortage of donor kidneys available. And so, I kind of wonder if we do add markets to things and maybe even, regulate parts of that market, whether allowing people to be compensated in the same way that we allow people to be compensated for plasma in this country. And as a result, we supply a lot of the world's plasma. It's basically just applying that model to things like, kidneys.
I think it's a little different because your plasma replenishes, unlike a kidney. But I take your point, Liz. Thanks so much for joining us.
There's a lot of good research on this. I highly recommend just not writing him off as a wackadoodle libertarian. I do think that there's some interesting things that he's going to pursue. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.